money to be made, and I just want it right now. Please get down or lie down when I'm in the grave. I need everything iced out. Dying is a lifestyle. Money to be made, and I just want it right now. Please get down or lie down when I'm in the grave. I need everything iced out. Dying is a lifestyle.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Analysis with Ro. I am your host, Ro, giving you the latest on all things media. And today's conversation is a very exciting one because finally we have essentially gotten into the convo of talking about a character I think is very interesting. We've finally gotten to the Hisoka character analysis. This will be a multi part series in which we will be basically doing the same thing we did with Illumi. We'll be diving into childhood, things that might have, indicated his mental health, just all kinds of different elements that I think all add to the characterization of a person. And we will contribute that to essentially looking deeper into his character in a sort of beyond the surface yet hopefully relatable and digestible manner. So we are going to have a pretty good time doing what I think will be a very interesting deep dive into a character I think a lot of people, I'm going to be honest with you, have a hard time understanding. And I think that is a lot to do with certain perceptions that can be illustrated within the anime adaptation. So I think having a more easier way of understanding this character with this analysis would be definitely something that I am interested in doing particularly. So everybody give a round of applause, you know? Thank you. Because we are going to dive straight into it. So let's get into the whole entire ordeal. The ever so elusive Hisoka is associated with much drama and controversy, as we know for his character in particular. But is that all there is to him? A provocateur? Of course not. There is so much more to his character. However, a mask covers much of his true nature, and he has way more complexities than the audience would like to give him credit for. So, let us reveal the tricks that is up this magician's like sleeve and see what he's truly about. And that is what we are here to do today, ladies, gentlemen, and MBs alike. Let's get straight into it. The first thing that we are going to explore, of course, is his childhood. As we talked about with the last character analysis with his fiancée, funny enough, we talked about how childhood is often the foundation of what makes a person who they are today. How your parents raised you, the environment that you had when you were a kid, tends to have a huge impact on your current adulthood. Everything has its connections, everybody. Everything has its connections. So, we're basically going to go into how it all began for this childhood. So, how did it all begin? What exactly started the blueprint for Hisoka Moro right here? Childhood, as we say again, is the foundation. And I cannot emphasize this enough. It's the foundation of who someone will be later in life. It's time in which development is at its most critical point, I should say. Given the many maladaptive traits that we see in his adulthood currently, like all the problematic traits that people do tend to see. And I will talk about in more detail, at least for his adult version later on with this analysis. But for now, everything has its origin point. That's what you need to know first and foremost. Okay? It's safe to assume that his childhood had a few cracks in his foundation. So, with this section that we are diving into, which is Unit 1, because unlike his fiance, because there's a lot more with his character involved, we divided it into units. Think of this whole entire character analysis like an audio version of a study book. So now we're in Unit 1, and we are going to be exploring Hisoka's childhood with this specific unit and how that impacts him throughout the story. The first thing, of course, that we are going to talk about is essentially the theory that I had, which is a mixture of heritage and where he has come from. Now, I said that he was essentially of mixed heritage, meaning he probably has multiple things intertwined. And on his mother's side, I said specifically that for the most part, because he was raised by his mom, that he would be raised most likely as someone who is of Hispanic Romani origin. We are going to talk more about that personal theory of mine today. So, Hosoka grew up with his mother during the earlier moments of his childhood, of course, before her death, at what I believe to be approximately about, I want to say, 11, like 10 to 12 years old. 10 probably most likely is the time in which of his mother passed away, so we can expect an approximation of him being around 10 when his mother passed, like fresh double digits. That's very unfortunate. So during his pre-adolescence is what I will most likely say for that time. So while growing up with her while she was alive, he has been immersed in what appears to be a Romani culture. And of course, we're going to talk more about the Romani people in a minute. But right now, what you need to know is that the Pacific kind that we will be discussing is Hispanic in its origin. So some clues about Hazawa includes the fact that his theme song is flamenco, and flamenco, it did not come from the white Spanish people. That is a common misconception. It came from the Romani people that lived within Spain and other Spanish speaking regions, but we're talking mostly about another Spanish speaking region that's Latin American. We'll get into it. But it comes from Spanish Romani, also known as Gintanos. So that is where it came from. And when I figured that out, I was shocked too. And I figured it out when I was around like 16 years old, is when I found out that essentially flamenco music was not made by the white population of Spain. It was actually made by Romani people, which, by the way, I barely knew um, who Romani people even were, to be honest, back when I was 16 years old. You know, I was exploring and I was figuring it out. And their culture, by the way, is very beautiful. I hope me speaking about it from a historical standpoint and other cultural indicators, I hope to do well with this, right? Because speaking of Spain and other European regions, unfortunately, they do tend to get demonized in those regions. Not so much in the US, luckily. Say what you want about the United States, but I will be very much so proud to say that we don't really blatantly do that as much versus in Europe, where like their racism against Romani people is a lot harsher. So there's that, you know. Yeah, that there's just a lot of tidbits that you need to know beforehand. But let's get into it. Enough about me, yapping on about my love for Romani culture, but also along with flamenco music, another thing I do have to say is his proficiency with cartomancy, and we'll talk a little bit of essentially how cartomancy is kind of embedded in a lot of Romani's spiritual practices. Along with that, it was used as a way to make money because traditionally, way back in the day, a lot of Romani people weren't really allowed to hold jobs due to discrimination. So they had other means like fortune telling and entertainment, and along with that, there's cartomancy, which is their way of reading cards based on their spiritual beliefs. And there's also this cool thing that they tend to do, which along with following along with the dominant religion, of course, for a lot of Hispanic Romani slash Latin Romani people, they tend to be Catholic. However, the way that they practice Catholicism is so cool and it's a lot different, but I will probably show a video of that someday. It's just so interesting. I could talk about it all day, but we don't have time for that. So let's dive into the culture that he was mostly raised in due to the fact that, again, he was raised by his mom, uh, who is a single parent. Dad was not involved. So even though dad, I made the assumption that he is of most likely French and East Asian origin of some kind, either Korean or Japanese. Now, y'all, the audience, can debate which one it is, but it doesn't really matter because let's be real, he wasn't really that involved in the first place. So, honestly, if it were me personally, I'm gonna be real with you. I don't think it matters. Yeah, unfortunately, I do not think it particularly matters whether or not what Pacific ethnicity or like origin his dad is, because it's like he's not really there. So he wasn't really immersed in that culture at all. Um he was immersed in essentially Hispanic Romani along with the more so mainstream American culture, specifically the one in the West or the West Coast. Our version of the West, theirs might be a bit different, but essentially the West Coast, because Glam Glassland is their version equivalent of Las Vegas. So that's essentially what he grew up with. Anything else, it's second place, if even. So, yeah, before we get into how Romani culture has essentially influenced Soso's character, we must first dive into the history of Romani people, as well as the Pacific type that the Moro family was. Now, I do believe that along with um, Hispanic Romani origin, another origin, which is probably distant, so it's not really like a high percentage, but it's still probably there. Of course, with Romani people, they tend to integrate, of course, and into the culture in which they are involved in. So probably long, long way back with great great grandparents or wherever, there are probably some family members or ancestors, if you will, that are from modern day Scottish origin, which probably explains the last name Moro. There was a lot of mixing of different kind of European um, people along with Romani people. So a lot of them, along with so many other groups of people, it's not just Romani, it's a lot of other groups of people, they tend to be quote unquote mixed in nature due to that, mixing and mashing back in the day for whatever reason. Um, so there's that. That probably would explain the Scottish last name. There was probably a mix going on back in the day. So maybe not anybody that's like closely related, like close family, but maybe like distant, like way, way, way back in the day. There was like an origin point in which, despite being the majority of Romani people, there was probably also a mixture of Scottish people as well. So that probably explains certain things. And again, you could see this with certain Romani people as well. Despite, and we'll talk about it, their people being of Indian origin, you do see that mix happening where you would probably see more so Eurocentric features, is probably the best way I can describe it, right? It's again an interesting thing to see. But anyways, Gintanos are what we're talking about today, and I've mentioned that. And they are a Romani ethnic group of Spanish descent, and their origins inhabit of Rajasthan and Punjab, an Indo-Aryan region now classified as Indian. So those are two Indian regions in which Gintanos originated from. Now, the word dom, which is of Indian parlance, refers to a man of low caste that includes scavengers, musicians, vagrants, traders, and weavers. This word, specifically, or the smaller word dom, is essentially thought to be the origin of the term Roma. So that's where Roma came from. If anybody tells you literally anything else, they are wrong. Tell them to go read a history book immediately, immediately. Okay? They're wrong. I'm just letting you know. If anybody says anything else, they are wrong. The original term is dumb. You translate it into probably more so English or other languages, it's going to come out Roma. That's it. Okay? Full stop on whatever debate someone might have with you. Because, like I said before, there are certain groups of people that love to heavily discriminate against Romani people. It's ridiculous. All kinds of racism is ridiculous. So, number one, you probably shouldn't pay it any mind, but if you do, just make them look stupid. All right? It's foolproof anytime because racism is stupid, anyways. I digress. Let's keep going. We will be concentrating specifically today on the Mexican group of the Hispanic Romani people because there's different kinds. There's Venezuelan Roma people. There's Roma people, of course, as we talked about a little bit on here from Spain. You have Roma people from Cuba. They do exist. You have Roma people from, I believe, it's Chile. Those ones are interesting. Okay, I've learned so much about Chilean Roman people. I mean, Roma people, Romani people. See, even I'm getting a little mixed up. The English language, everybody. And there's so many other different kinds, but specifically right now, we are going to be discussing the Romani people of Mexico. And they are primarily migrants, of course, because of their persecution having to come to America in the early Spanish conquest from the Old World. Because, like I said before, a lot of the times they migrate from one place to another due to another group, historically a European group of some kind, not really rocking with the fact that, oh, they're so different, their culture is so different. Historically, you know how Europeans tend to react to cultures that are different from them. Not well. So, as a result, you have this group of people, Romani people, which originally came from India, and they probably went to other areas due to conflicts that happened back then. So they went to other areas that they deemed safer than the current modern day India. And come to find out, in certain areas, it probably wasn't really safer per se because of how people reacted to them. Um, and we're gonna get into that, a little bit more because speaking of which, the term Gintano and it relates to what a lot of, I guess, it's the Spanish version of an English term, which I will not say. The only reason I'm saying the Spanish one, because essentially the Spanish population of Roma people do not mind if you say that word. But however, the English version of that word I will not say because it is considered a slur. So I won't be saying the English version. Only reason I'm saying the Spanish version because it's deemed okay, specifically by the Spanish Roma population. They don't mind if you call them that. Matter of fact, a lot of them are more than okay with it. But if you call them the English version, now it's an insult. So I'm trying my very best to follow the rules. However, if someone were to tell me something else and say, actually, it's not okay for you to say the Spanish version either, I won't say that either. I probably will redo this episode. But for now, we are just going to try not to use the Spanish version as much either. But just know that's why I won't be saying the English one. You'll probably figure out what it is if you were to translate what Chintano is. Again, not saying it because it's now considered a slur. Just so you know. So, also the main reason for that is because it's just also inaccurate. The origin of why the slur came to be is because um, for some ridiculous reason, the Europeans that came upon the Romani people, they thought they were of, it's a mixture of different things if you were to do your research. I saw they thought they were of Egyptian origin. Before they found out that they were actually from India, they thought these people were from Egypt. And I guess that's what they wanted to call Egyptians. It's a really complex form of history that has a lot of origin points, but that is the most popular one that you will see. So that's probably the one that we're going to go with. Again, you could do your own research to figure it out. I'm just here to tell you, you are probably going to get more than one answer. Okay? Okay. Now that we understand some of the Romani people's history and origin, let's explore what influences Hisoka's mom might have had on Hisoka's thoughts through her culture itself. Basically, we already talked about the origin point of Romani people. So now that you know the basics, okay, we are going to dive a little bit more deeper into kind of some of how Hisoka might have been involved within the culture, you know, being born as a little baby, boop, 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 into that culture and basically having to assimilate slash acculturate into it by his own mama. So first, let us imagine the scene. I'm going to set the scene for you guys, okay? Let's assume that you are a kid living in a small trailer park region, a trailer park neighborhood per se. Your mother is familiar with everybody as you're from the same tribe, essentially. Of course, given that this is the United States, like I said before, the Romani population, they tend to talk, interact with people of other origins, of course. So it's not just Romani people. You will probably also have mixed conversations with the African or Black population. You know, a lot of, for example, with flamenco, not only was it of original Romani origin, but there's a mixture of all different kinds of other cultures in there, including some Arabic. And that's mostly due to the fact that, you know, Romani people were basically talking to other minorities during the time in which flamenco music was invented, and having all those different cultures basically be like, ooh, let me add this to your music and let me add that. It's a beautiful thing to have basically that kind of mixing pot for, you know, music that again originally came from them. And you'll see that with like a lot of things, including their food. But let's assume that again, due to mostly proximity, the majority of people there are kind of like you. If they are not of Romani origin, at the very least, they're Hispanic, just like you are, right? So you come from the same tribe. They are very tribal, though I will say that for Roma people. It's a mixture of like open and closed at the same time. Um, but yeah, you'll find people that are similar to you, and the elders of the neighborhood. They cook some amazing food. You know what I mean? This is an easy thing to imagine because again, Mexican food is delicious. All right, I love Mexican food personally. This is a little bit of an antidote, little bit. But for a lot of people, I'm not the only one who thinks this Mexican food is spectacular. So you smell that food outside because of the vending like trucks and the little vending carts, I guess. I don't know what you would call it, but vending carts do on special occasions. And you have festivals that always brighten up your days. So imagine all of that within this neighborhood. It's very colorful, vibrant neighborhood. Not to mention, again, you would probably see like dancing all around. It's good times, great times. Sometimes either your mother or one of the elders, again, would teach you some traditional songs and dances in their homes. And as the people around you, they would bustle in the streets, you hear all kinds of languages. You might hear a little bit of English, but considering how um, a lot of Romani people as well as other people. It's not just Romani people. I know this is true for my culture in particular too. I'm Congolese for reference. You would hear English, of course, but along with English, because they live in the equivalent of the US, I don't know if there would be an equivalent version of English or it would just be English. Regardless, imagine you hear that in the streets, right? However, probably with a accent behind it. Another language that you would hear within the streets, of course, other than English, is you would hear the traditional tongue of Galo mixed with Spanish. And Galo is essentially one of the many more so traditional Roma languages that come about. So think of it this way. I think the best example I'm going to use is, of course, my culture. My culture, we have like Lingala, for example. That's more so our tribal language. And the more so mainstream language that we mix in with that said tribal language is French. So a lot of the times, if you hear a Congolese person speak, if they don't speak Swahili, because there are also Congolese people that speak Swahili, if you don't hear Swahili, you probably hear Lingala. And along with Lingala, you'll probably hear some French, sometimes mixed together. The same thing is probably what you can imagine happening to a mixture of Galo and Spanish. You'll probably hear some Spanish, you'll probably hear some Galo, you'll probably hear it mixed all together. And it's from what I have heard so far through my research. Let me just tell you, it's a beautiful language. It's also, this is the thing about, Romani tribal languages more so, their language is closed off. There's not a lot that you can hear. The fact that I was able to hear some of it throughout my research is a rarity in and of itself because of how closed off it is. And it's closed off for protection reasons, you know, which I mean valid. It's actually pretty understandable why they would close it off. But just know the reason why it's probably extremely hard to learn is because it's not really something that most outsiders get to really hear in the first place. Um, and again, a lot of people who are of Romani origin, they tend to hide it due to discrimination, unfortunately. So due to like protections for generations upon generations, it's nothing new. They tend to hide it. So that's why you would see, especially with them, why they tend to mix it with more so mainstream um, languages, such as currently, as we're discussing right now, Spanish. Of course, I know there's Roma people that are in Russia that will mix whatever. I didn't look up like the Eastern European version of a more so native Roma language, which again comes from Indian origin. mixed in with Russian. I have not looked that up yet, and that is my fault in particular. um, my fault, kind of, sort of, but also I'm not really learning about, Eastern European Roma people. I'm more so learning about Spanish slash Hispanic, so that's my range of things. So that's why we're learning about Galo. That's just some of the things that you need to know about it. That it is closed off. It's a closed language. Again, most of the time you won't really learn about it unless you kind of marry into the culture, or two, if you are very good friends with a Romani person and they're willing to teach you. The thing is, you can't really teach it to anybody else unless you have their permission. It's really close. And again, it's for protection reasons. They do this for protection reasons. I cannot emphasize that enough. It's for protection. So, that's interesting, right? Because especially with Hisoka, we later find out he is engaged currently. I don't think anybody who has read the manga will be surprised by that. It'll be like, yeah, I know. But probably something interesting that you could add on to like facts of the day is there is a potential that Illumino's Kalo. that's that's something new for you guys to add to the list of things. So there we go. And sometimes English, but honestly, you probably won't hear a lot of English within these streets in particular, because especially in what I believe to be their origin point, or where they are currently, not currently, but like where they were within their equivalent of the US. So probably their version would be like the South, but essentially for us, it would be like North Las Vegas. There is a high Hispanic population just in general. So you'll probably be hearing a lot more Spanish than you probably would English. It's kind of similar to like Miami, despite the fact that you're in the US. You are probably going to hear a lot more Spanish, and that's due to the Cuban population that's over there. It's the same thing for essentially Las Vegas. I did not look up what Pacific kind, but I can make my guess and assumptions based off of history, especially with the Wild Wild West, that the majority of the Hispanic population within places like California and Las Vegas is mostly, again, Mexican. Hence why I said that, having Mexican Romani people there, aka having his family origin there, it's not really hard to kind of assimilate into that, considering the vast similarities of Mexican Romani people, which, by the way, has their own little migration story of way back in the day. Of course, they first migrated to, I think it's Guadalajara. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. My apologies. Guadalajara and other regions within Mexico, of course, their ancestors migrated to there, you know. Basically, they were there, they were living there within Mexico for a little bit. And then later on, I think for specifically like Hisoka's ancestors, they decided why not go to the upper portions of Northern America, or basically Sahara, and basically move on upwards to their equivalent of Las Vegas sometime in probably around either the 1800s or 1900s. It depends on how you want to think about it personally, but nonetheless, they're there now. They've been there for a little bit, and yeah, migrants, immigrants, we get the job done. So regardless, it all feels like home to you. We talked about how this would particularly be imagined, right? The imagery of essentially being around this kind of environment, being around this town, this community of people, right? Feels like home. While nobody has as much as people in the inner cities, right? Because they're more so on the outskirts, within like the trailer park regions. So it's not really in the city, right? We'll get into my theory in about a minute, actually, as to what particularly happened. So I think originally, and this is just my thing, and we'll continue exploring this with the tea talk of the day, but probably started in the outskirts and then a little bit later, probably most likely due to Hisoka's dad's influence. Um, his mother decided, for the sake of a better opportunity, maybe we should go into the inner city. But come to find out, as we know, his father is not is not a very responsible man. He ain't shit. There's no other way to say it. He ain't shit. So basically abandoned his family you know, and now they are just stranded. They did the best they could though, and they started surviving within the inner cities. But we probably won't dive into that again until we get to like a tea talk of the day discussing more of that concept and theory of mine once again. So this is what we do need to know. Hisoka is familiar and with the life that I have basically gave you an imagery of, and he was born into this very beautiful, diverse, complex world when he was born approximately on June the 6th, 1992. This is my mathematics based on the modern day timeline. However, if you are on the 99 timeline instead of the modern day, probably change 1992 to around, I want to say 1972. So probably change it to that if you're on the 90s timeline. However, we're on the modern day one. So it's 1992. He's basically in his early 30s currently. So, to Miss Morrow. And the reason why I say Miss Morrow is because her first name is unknown. We do not know his mother's first name. I call her Miss Morrow or Ahsoka's mom. That is not me being I don't know what the assumption would be, like me being sexist or whatever. I literally do not know Miss Thing's name. It's never been revealed to us, so we just go based off of her last name, or come to find out, either her last name or just her as a mom. That's it. But she's a very important figure in this man's life, so no disrespect, of course. It's not a disrespectful thing for me to do that. It's because I don't know her name. There's no other way to address her. And an unknown father who was not present throughout his entire childhood, practically. And if there were any moments of presentness, probably not enough to indicate anything actually important. So basically, his dad out the picture, not even there. Um, let's just say negligence is a common thing within this story. Him and Jing have a lot of things in common. And I say that, right, mostly because of my personal beef. But I'm not talking about Gon. That kid, we will dive into him and his family life and his character in a minute. We're on his side. We're on his dad, who is negligent in nature as well. Okay, there we go. High negligence was barely there. If he was there, not enough to indicate anything impactful or anything of grand importance. Barely there, if at all. Okay, I don't even know why I'm giving him credit for barely, because from the looks of it, not at all. So, he was born in an impoverished area of Glamglass City in the United States of Sahara, otherwise known as, again, their version of Las Vegas, and of course, their version of the United States of America. I do think if they have a flag, and this is just me personally doing a little bit of imagination, I do think that if they had a flag, I think it'd be like the inverse version of our flag, right? So it'd still be like red, white, and blue. But I looked up what an inverse version of the United States flag would look like, and it had, instead of red and white stripes, it of course would be blue and white stripes, and the panel which shows the stars was in red instead of blue. That shit fascinated me. The stars were still white though, but the panel was red. It had white stars. It was just this very cool thing. I loved it. I fucking loved it. It was amazing just seeing it. I was like, wow, so that's what the inverse version of our flag looks like. It was truly something to see. Okay. But anyways, continuing on, growing up within the Mexican Romani culture, it means you pick up a few things. Of course, we know this. This tends to be a thing with like all cultures, not just Mexican Romani, but that's the one we're talking about. So, both positive and negative traits of the culture, some of which include social norms, and this brings us into discussion of machismo culture, which is a culture that is on a lot of Hispanic slash Latin American cultures. It's a certain belief system that we will dive into in a little bit, and how it might influence Hisoka to some degree. Though he was a young boy, children will understand the basis of things like gender roles by the age of 3. So, therefore, the impacts of machismo culture will still be affecting him even at a young age. Of course, the first thing to figure out is what machismo culture is. Well, in this mini section, we will find out what machismo culture is and some early impacts they might have on Ahsoka. Now, I do want to preface and say that even though some people, I know you're going to say this, well, he's queer, right? So he clearly shows like alternative versions of said masculinity. And I don't think he's necessarily afraid of femininity per se. And it's like, you are correct. We will dive into queer masculinity in his adulthood unit. However, we're not there yet. And as with most kids, including queer kids, you tend to get socialized with the sex that you are assigned first, right? Before you dive into any other parts about yourself, right? Myself included, despite me also being a queer person, I was socialized as feminine. And there's certain traits that I still have to this day due to that socialization. So it's not out of left field for me to explore that. Also, certain traits that we currently see with his character does attribute to masculinity. Do not let the clothes confuse you, okay? Especially for the manga version. You will see a lot of these traits and it'd be like, oh yeah, girl, I see what you're talking about. It makes a lot of sense now. We're gonna get into it, but for right now, we're gonna talk about the origin points of that with childhood, in childhood socialization. So let's get into it, okay? So first and foremost, let us take a break, okay? I thought about it, and we kind of need a break for a minute. I know I do. So we are going to take a quick break before we get into how the impacts of like gender socialization and stratification. I don't know if that's the right word, but gender socialization, machismo culture. How does it impact the early developments of this character and basically being socialized as masculine for this particular character? We're going to dive into that after the break. So, again, go grab a couple snacks, grab some water. You deserve it because this has been a very long conversation. And part 2 will be just as long. So you might need a minute to process all the information that I gave you. For part 2 especially, if you don't already have one, you might want to grab a notebook when we come back because there are a lot more notes that need to be taken. Because like I said before, this is like a study book, all right? We're on unit 1 right now. And I hope that you get your education on, get you a notebook and some pen or pencil and start diving into it. But before we do that, we're just gonna take a break. And I also need a break because my throat is hurting. It is hurting, and I think we all deserve a minute. So we'll be right back with today's programming in a little bit. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Analysis with Ro. I am your host, Ro, giving you the latest on all things media. Welcome back from our break, of course. Um, Let us dive into what we are going to be talking about, which is essentially the concepts of masculinity being socialized, like gender socialization, masculinity, and machismo culture, which is where we stopped at. So, the current Hisoka that we know within the story tends to portray certain traits that basically fit under the description of toxic masculinity. Okay? However, these traits did not appear out of nowhere. Rather, they are more extreme consequences of the socializations of men/slash masculine individuals. The Hunter x Hunter world equivalent of America is most likely where Hisoka grew up in. He was raised by his mother in a Hispanic community, more likely than not. The truth of the matter is that the start of gender socialization tends to begin at a young age, typically from ages 2 and 3 years old. So, from that point onward, children can identify themselves as either boys or girls and classify others based on social and visual cues. That is the basic tit for tat info that you would need to know. Continuing on, by age 3, Hisoka as well as other American children know the traditional expectations for men/slash masculine individuals and women/slash feminine individuals by social conditioning. I say American, but it's not just American, it's literally everybody in the world. However, we are talking mostly about Western expectations. And this tends to happen by social conditioning. And this can range from parents, peers, and the media. So, mixture of parent influence, peer influence, and media influence. So when children are 4 to 5 years old, they then become aware of gender based occupational limitations, and feelings of vulnerability and dependency are then deemed inappropriate for male children. So basically, they tend to learn about occupational limitations that, their feminine counterparts tend to have more often than not, and like gender stereotypes. Along with that, there is also the learning of for male children that their feelings of vulnerability and dependency again is deemed very much so inappropriate. You're not allowed to cry. You have to be a big strong man. It starts young. It's all based, and this is all based on the gender schema theory, which of course suggests that children can create schemas for both masculine and feminine characteristics and activities based on their accumulated experiences. Now, for his own social conditioning, was most likely influenced by his single mother's teaching, because again, we all have um, biases that may not be the healthiest. All people who are more so on the feminine side of the gender spectrum, you might have some form of internalized misogyny. And it's okay to admit that, because every single day you are unlearning those biases and becoming a better human, hopefully. For people who choose not to do that, of course, we see the consequences of that a lot of the times. But we all have unlearned biases that we need to kind of tap into and realize that, oh, that needs to be changed, right? You might have certain discriminatory beliefs in your head. It's like, wow, I never thought I had that before. My mistake. You know what I mean? It happens to the best of us. So, of course, with his mom, especially in the 90s, she was probably a great woman, probably ahead of her time in a lot of things, but she's human, not perfect. So, of course, there might be some things that she might have instilled in her kids still, even if it's unintentional. It doesn't have to be intentional to have its impact. But it also could have been influenced by older figures in his community. So, again, other men within his community, because as we know, his dad was not present. So, of course, like most children, they tend to want to be inspired by people older than them and people that are similar to them, right? For boys, they tend to look up to older men within their community a lot of the times, especially if, their dad isn't really present. They got to find an older, you know, masculine figure somehow. So there we go. And the media influences around him. And given that he lives in an entertainment mecca, the media influences could have been more extreme, because that tends to happen with show business. So, given that Ahsoka was raised in a Western culture or its equivalent, as well as the possibility of additional factors such as adultification, which, by the way, is a lot different than his spouse's version of adultification. So, for his spouse specifically, Um, his version of adultification for Illumi was essentially, as we know, parentification and trauma. That was Illumi's reason for adultification. Hisoka's version for adultification is most likely due to a mixture of poverty and kind of having to take certain steps, basically taking certain adult roles due to what poverty with a single parent tends to do. There's some roles that the child feels the need to fill in because of the fact that the other parent that's supposed to do that doesn't do that. So it's not that bad. I don't think it's as bad as the possibility of something like emotional incest. I don't think it's gone that far for his parents. I don't think him and his mom have a sense of enmeshment. I just think due to certain circumstances of poverty, naturally children tend to mature a lot quicker in those circumstances, just off the bat, like just naturally. So it tends to be, again, of a consequence of growing up from poverty and, of course, a violent neighborhood potentially, because with poverty tends to come crimes. Poverty, crime, the stats are there. Okay. I don't need to tell you about it. It's pretty common knowledge. And being raised within, again, a single parent household. Now, I'm not demonizing single parents because, like I said, it's not just single parenthood. Single parenthood mixed in with other factors such as poverty, kind of being the main reason that we tend to see a lot of the other issues that people tend to talk about. They don't take the class thing into consideration, and I will. I'm built different like that. I will take class into consideration. A lot of the times it is due to poverty. So there is a chance of him adopting certain hypermasculine traits as a form of self protection. After all, as Bell Hooks once stated, boys are not necessarily seen as lovable in patriarchal culture. Even though sexism has always decreed that boy children have more status than girls, status and even privilege awards are not the same as being loved. Okay, some of these characteristics are now present in more extreme forms, such as, emphasizing physical strength, dominating others, and being selfish, just to name a few. But the main reason a lot of these traits came about, again, is probably due to survival reasons. See, in a lot of impoverished areas or areas that would be considered nicknames such as the hood or the ghetto or any other name that you would like to state, um, being perceived as weak leaves you as prey, which is not a good thing, right? Because you are more likely to have a crime committed against you if people do not fear you. So, in order to not have anything happen to you, you probably have to take on a couple of actions that, again, especially for a kid, will probably be age inappropriate, right? A little too mature for that age group. But again, main reason it's done is due to survival reasons. Gotta do what you gotta do to survive type mentality. So machismo culture, which favors an emphasis on a hyper masculine lifestyle, strongly promotes these characteristics among lower class Hispanic, Latino, and Roma households. Now, it's not just lower class. However, the way that it tends to be manifested in lower class versus upper class is a lot different. So, we're going to talk about the lower class version because this character, at least within his past, was lower class. Recently, he's upper class, and we'll get into that when we get into that. But for right now, lower class. Okay? Okay. This culture is a strong or exaggerated sense of manliness, an assumption that virility, courage, strength, and the right to dominate are characteristics of masculinity. This is a social construct of masculinity for most Latin American and Hispanic communities, which seems to be the community that Hisoka might have been raised in, of course, before his mother's death. We've talked about this. So, similar to its counterpart in the West, this kind of socialization does not usually promote the healthiest of characteristics. Some examples of machismo attitudes and expectations are, and I'm going to probably butcher it, I haven't spoken Spanish in a little bit. La mujer tiene que querer su hombre. La mujer tiene que querer su hombre porque es la mujer. Or, in English, the woman has to attend her man because she's a woman. Fortunately, thank the stars, he does not appear to have this specific mindset or attitude. I think he would be a lot worse if he did. Um, Due to a combination of probably not wanting to be a burden to his mom, doesn't want to do that. Kind of seen his mom struggling as is, so it's like, you know what? I'm not going to do that to other women. He may be a jackass a lot of the times, but he's not that much of a jackass, luckily. So there's that, along with his queerness. That too. Again, there is some respect to his feminine counterparts, okay? Which is a lot more credit than I would probably give to his other masculine counterparts or the average man, for short. It's a low expectation, but it's an expectation nonetheless. Bare minimum. Like, wow, thank you for not thinking that, you know? Not really a lot of high effort, but the effort is there, okay? The effort is definitely there. So, with that being said, let us continue. And another mentality, of course, is no ses huron, sos hombre. Or, don't be a crybaby, you're a man. He did adopt this mentality a lot. Oh, yeah, a lot. I think for people that have, looked into his character, I don't think it was that much of a surprise to be like, oh, yeah, he definitely adopted this mentality. For sure, for sure. In addition to his local community, he may have derived some of his social program inspiration from various media forms, including print magazines, television, stage performances, as well, because again, this is the equivalent of Las Vegas. And basically his environment around him in general, because, the strip, there's a lot of showgirls, there's a lot of men in casinos. So you'll see like that version of masculinity, which is heavy, and we'll talk about this in a minute, heavy in materialism, especially heavy in grandeur. So during the 1990s, again, there was a strong emphasis on men being assertive and materialistic, and it was especially heavy in probably where he's from because he lives right in the crux of a lot of hedonistic shit, which is Glam Glass City, aka Las Vegas for us. So, in this mini section, we'll look into how the 90s version of masculinity affected Hisoka's socialization and possibly influenced his character. This next part is basically how the 1990s masculinity impacted Hisoka's childhood. So, after we explored a little bit of machismo culture, we're going to see how that mixes into the more so mainstream Western version of masculinity that he also could have been influenced by. Let's talk about it. Media can influence how a person perceives the world by displaying specific messages on either the screen or on paper. One of the ways it influences the minds of everybody, but especially children, is through how it portrays gender. So when Masaoka was a child in the 90s, he probably would have been introduced to the world of television and film by either watching it on one of his mother's friends, because his mother is poor. However, because it's a community of people, someone in that community has a TV. They have a TV screen. So one of his mom's friends in the neighborhood have a TV. Kids go over to watch and hang out, okay? Or by sneaking into his local movie theaters. He snuck into it, getting in for free, okay? While exploring the town. It was probably not that hard to sneak in. Probably just had to look adorable, adorable, mind you, because he is a kid. In front of a couple of, maybe the girl cashiers or whatever. It'd be like, look cute. Be like, oh, he's schmo. He's cute. He can go in. They probably let his ass in. How could it be done? It's insane. you imagine? You're imagining it right now. It's like this little man is already getting started, okay, with the ladies. And I'm trying not to make it sound weird, okay? Because I don't think we'll get into like more so the weirdness or like anything that is more of a controversial topic until we get to him being more so a teenager. Because that's when the weird stuff starts happening. Right now, as a kid, people just look at him and be like, oh, cute baby. Okay? It's innocence right now. Innocence. Okay? So, through this exposure, the screen, as well as magazines, have also impacted his social programming into masculinity because that's what he socialized to be. For example, during this time, there was a heavy emphasis on showing your masculinity by being involved in consumerism and materialistic behaviors in general. This was shown in magazines such as, for example, Playboy and Penthouse. There was a lot of, especially back in the 90s, there was a lot of Playboy parties, okay? There was a lot of craziness going on in Vegas or Glam Glass City. I don't know what their equivalent of Playboy would be. Maybe theirs is like legitimately named Play Bunny. Probably something of that nature. You know, they got to do that because of copyright. They got to do that because of copyright. So, in which, let's continue. It tends to have a Casanova persona flaunt around a hedonistic and materialistic image of expensive clothing and other new items, along with expensive activities such as yachting. Other than these images being seen as tools that would attract women, for kids like Hisoka, this could also feed into more so of that escapist fantasy of luxury, which might later be used as a motivation for seeking fame. Because again, I'm poor. I don't want to be poor no more. I'm seeing this fantasy life in like magazines and TV and all of that. I want to live there. I want to live where the big dogs are. I'm inspired. Starts young. Okay? Getting inspiration at a young age. Besides magazines, there are also TV programs such as MTV, which often displays music videos with women being objectified and men showing lavish items. Now, again, we have kind of a mixture of later in his adulthood, kind of a sense of queer masculinity, which also I think is due to the popularization around the 90s. There's also a time of metrosexual. So basically, you would see a lot of men, again, portraying more so alternative versions of masculinity. You would see like a Prince, you would see like a Freddie Mercury, you would see those figures. I believe around this time music too, but there's plenty of examples like David Bowie and whatnot for like the 80s and 90s. There were definitely a lot of alternative versions as well that, you know, has probably taken a huge contribution on how he views masculinity as well. But we probably won't see as huge of an impact for that until like around the time he's like a teenager. So for right now, just know that those influences are there, you know, for more so alternative forms of masculinity. But along with the mainstream, of course, you're going to get your objectification of women. You're going to see men showing lavish items. I think he might have been influenced by both. But obviously, we see more so of the showing of lavish items. So, along with children's media, male characters are portrayed within children's media as aggressive, dominant, and engaged in exciting activities for which they receive rewards, which range from monetary to affection from their female/feminine protagonists. So all of this kind of contributes, right, into what this character perceives as like normal. Is it great? No, because like I said before, and a lot of other times, the socialization of both the feminine and masculine, but masculine, right, especially within Western culture, it's not healthy. Honestly, it just helps contribute to like capitalism and white supremacy, but that's an entirely different conversation for a different day. But just in general, it's not the healthiest. But that's how a lot of people were socialized to be. So, in addition to magazines and television shows, stereotypical portrayals of gender that distort people's mentalities are common within movies, especially. For example, in Harrison Ford's films, heroic male characters are often sexually aggressive and assertive, which promotes the normalization of coercion and other behaviors that are unfortunately, and I cannot emphasize this enough, unfortunately, associated with what we now consider to be rape culture. However, back in the day, it wasn't considered that because it was normal. For example, like in a lot of rom coms, right? A lot of behaviors that we now consider creepy, it was considered normal back then for a lot of the rom coms that we have seen, right? The Notebook is a psychological horror, okay? But for a lot of, people, men and women, uh, this is kind of more so socializing them into thinking, oh, yeah, it's totally normal to interact with the opposite sex slash gender in this way. It's not. It's not normal. But it seems to be that way because, again, of the extremeness and exaggeration of gender stereotypes within media, like all forms of media, but especially film and television. Books, too, but that's a different conversation. Anyways, promotes coercion, promotes sexual aggression. Not good. Not okay. But there are certain traits that this character has that's like, why is he like that? Along with, as we'll later come to find out, we'll explore ASPD way later in his adult unit. But along with that, it's a mixture of that and male socialization. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm not gonna lie. So this, along with the peeping tom trope that existed back then, which shows male characters being involved in voyeuristic behaviors, has implanted in the young minds of these boys that the rite of passage to masculinity is often at the disparagement of women slash feminine people. Thus, normalizing some predatory behavior may have contributed to Hisoka's perception of his masculinity even as an adult. And we do see those consequences. A lot. I am not going to lie to you. Again, as much as I like this character, I am a bitch that likes pointing out people's flaws. Okay? This is one of them. Naturally, there were other cultural influences like food and music too. So now that we're done talking about concepts of masculinity, there were other cultural influences like food and music that also have impact on upbringing in addition to early gender socialization. These factors, they greatly influence his early experiences in the world. The acculturation of mixing Hispanic Romani culture with mainstream American culture is attributed to who he is as a person as well. So hopefully in the next episode, we will be exploring what a day in the life routine of a Hispanic Romani kid looks like and see how it attributes to Hisoka's character. But for right now, I'm going to end this episode on a goodbye, see you later, and keep on exploring, everybody.